This video was made in association with KnifeInformer.com. Head on over to Knife Informer for all of your blade-related needs, including reviews, comparisons, stats, and more. What is up, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Lovely Loners. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at this WE Knives 707. This knife is on loan to me from a coworker who has recently decided that he's going to branch out outside of American-made knives, and he purchased this knife through Mastrop and was kind enough to lend it to me for review. So I'm very thankful for the opportunity to be able to check this out. Thank you to Jason for lending it to me for an extended period of time, so I had ample time to be able to play around with it and check it out. And let's just go ahead and jump right in. The first thing we're going to do is a size comparison, and I finally did get a scale so we can start taking a look at the weights of knives. So normally with the size comparisons, all I have to line it up against is the PM2, but I realized that it might be worthwhile bringing in an even cheaper knife that people are familiar with, which is the Rat 2. And I've had this knife for well over a year, and I just never really busted it out for size comparison, so I do apologize for that if there was anybody out there who has one of these that had been wishing that I used it. So you can see that the 707 is almost identical in terms of dimensions compared to the PM2. They have very similar thicknesses, even though the PM2 has a flat handle versus the 707, which has a contoured handle. You can see that their length is virtually identical. The tallness of the blade itself is extraordinarily similar, and then the thickness of the handle is pretty comparable in each different place. The bolster is similarly sized. This section of the grip area is similarly sized, though it does get a little bit tighter on the PM2 here, and then throughout the rest of the handle area you have similar dimensions as well, though the PM2 does stay rather thick through the rear end here, whereas the 707 tapers off a little bit. As far as the Rat 2 is concerned, you can see it does dwarf the Rat 2 in terms of size. So if this is the kind of size of knife that you're looking for in terms of your EDC, obviously the 707 is going to be a little bit too large for that kind of smaller carry. And, you know, I don't think WE Knives has done too much in the way of smaller carries. There's a couple of models that have definitely come down in size compared to their larger models. For example, the 604 that I have, which is extraordinarily long, and then of course the 707, which is pretty average size for WE Knives and their current lineup. So let's go ahead and get these out of the way and get the scale out here. So here we are. Go ahead and get this turned on, and we'll go ahead and see how much this weighs. So it looks like we're right at about 4.23 ounces. That's going to be slightly heavier than some people's desired carry weight. I know a lot of people like to keep it under 4 ounces, but as far as I'm concerned, it's a perfectly reasonable weight. Anywhere between 3.5 and 4.5 ounces seems to be a pretty good sweet spot for a reasonably sized knife like this one. Obviously, if you're looking at something in a smaller package, something like a Rat 2, for example, then you would want it to be lighter in reflection of the overall size, but for a full-sized carry like this one, 4.23 ounces is going to be perfectly reasonable in my opinion. Alright, now that we got that out of the way, we can go ahead and jump into the features and flaws. The first thing that I want to get out of the way on this knife is the action. Let's just go ahead and talk about the action up front. In typical WE fashion, it's excellent for the price. It's top-notch action. They, of course, use ceramic bearings and offer pretty drop-shut movements. WE Knives are always a pleasure to fidget with, and it's really no different here. Though I will say the knife definitely operates better as a little bit more of a push button than it does a light switch. You can see here, if we completely just fat finger as a light switch, we don't quite get deployment, which is pretty normal for a lot of knives. But as long as we have a little bit of pressure going into the knife, you're going to get excellent deployment each and every time. So you can see here that with a light shake, a really light shake, it really doesn't take much with this knife, the blade absolutely drops shut, and becomes completely closed every time. It's very consistent. A big thing that I like with a good action is consistency. There are certain knives where you can shake it the same way 100 times, and whether or not the knife actually drops closed seems to be entirely random. Whereas this knife is very consistent. As long as you get a good hit on that flipper tab, you're going to get great deployment every time. It really doesn't take a lot of effort. It's just important that you get a little bit more of a push buttony angle working, and you're going to get great deployment. And then of course, you guys can see for yourselves, it's very, very smooth in terms of dropping shut. We Knives does a great job with their actions. They're pretty darn consistent with it as far as consistency goes. Consistency is a tough thing in the knife world, especially with where I tend to reside, which is more of the customs world. Consistency is a little lacking there, but even in the production world, it can be a little shaky sometimes depending on the manufacturer. But We Knives always does a really good job of giving you those awesome high-end actions at a totally reasonable price point. So I just wanted to get that really positive remark out of the way. You guys know by now that I'm a huge fanboy of We Knives. It's not that I think they can do no wrong, but I've always just been really happy with the products that they put out for the price that they put them out for. And so this is definitely an excellent action. If you're looking for a knife that you want to fidget with, or something that is just going to be a little bit more on that high end in terms of dropping shut and everything like that, this knife and really most We Knives are going to be an excellent choice for that. So moving on, I want to talk about the ergonomics. The ergonomics on this one are excellent in the rearmost position. So you can see here I'm holding the knife in a saber grip, and when I hold the knife like this, it's very good ergonomics. But they start to get iffy if you move up and start to use the finger choil. So I want to talk a little bit about that. If you have the typical saber grip in the rearmost position like this, you can see here that there's a reasonably large curved section here that is larger than just for one index finger, and you are actually able to get 2 fingers into this section fairly reasonably. I have pretty thick, fat fingers, even though I have a medium glove hand. And you can see that I fit in there with room to spare on either side. There's still about another little bit more than 1/8 of an inch on this end before I actually reach the point. And you can see there's a little bit of space here before I actually get jammed up against the flipper tab as well. So I do believe that even if my hand was a little bit larger, that I would still be able to comfortably get both fingers in this section. And so I definitely appreciate that. And then as we continue to wrap our hand around the handle, you can see that there's this flat section here for the remaining 2 fingers to fit into. And so that means that you get a really good feeling when you wrap your fingers around the handle, and it feels made for your hand, and there aren't any crazy spots where you grip and you're like kind of right on the point. That's definitely an issue that I have with a lot of knives, so happy with the ergonomics there. And then as we get to the spine of the knife, you see there's this nice big curved section for your thumb to be resting in. So if we go ahead and put our thumb there, you can see that it pretty much perfectly matches both the curvature of my thumb and the size of my thumb. And again, there is a little bit more space on either end for a larger thumb to be able to fit in here. So if you do have larger hands, this knife will work out for you. The lender of this knife, Jason, does have slightly larger hands than me, and I do know that the ergonomics work out very well for him as well. So this is a great little section for your thumb, and then these cool little dashes that are milled into the knife are actually what turn into the jimping. So you can see here that there is jimping all through this section here. It's fairly rounded off, so it's not too hot, it's not too sharp. They did a good job there. And then I like that the jimping transitions into a cool design feature on the blade. I'm really happy with that. I think that was clever design, and they did a good job there. But from a mechanical standpoint, I am able to really dig my thumb in here, and I don't feel, you guys, it's kind of hard to show on video, but if you can see like that, I am absolutely jamming my thumb into this jimping right now, and you can see it's not slipping, it's not going anywhere. I have really good control over the knife right now, and you can see I left marks on my thumb. That's how hard I'm pushing, and there's no chance of slippage at all. This is some of the best jimping that I've come across in a while, and the fact that it has this angle to it, which really lets you bear down and not slip forward on the knife, is really helpful. So it's definitely an excellent kind of ergonomic design for piercing, and I really appreciate that. They did a good job there. So that's the ergonomics when you're kind of backed up on the knife, which is of course how you're typically going to use the knife. However, I'm usually a big fan of finger choils, and I think that they failed here. The finger choil on this knife just doesn't quite work out with both the ergonomics, nor is the choil itself the most comfortable thing. So let's talk a little bit about that. If we choke up on the knife here, this section still works out pretty well. I'm still able to get both of these fingers into this section, which leaves my pinky to just kind of hang out wherever it wants. That's reasonable. And even up here, my thumb, it can't quite rest flat in the same way. But if I do bear down on it at this angle, it's still great jimping. It still gives me great control over the knife. And I honestly still feel very much in control. If I did have to pierce through something and be very careful with it, this would be a totally reliable way to hold the knife. Having said that, the distance between the finger choil where your index finger is able to lie and back here where your middle finger ends up is pretty significant. It's a solid half of an inch, more than half of an inch of distance that your fingers are split up. And that's not totally unusual, but because of how shallow the finger choil is, you end up kind of slipping back here, and it just doesn't feel super great. I would like a little bit less distance between this finger and this finger if it was me personally. And the thing that I really want to point out here is that the finger choil, they did not keep it thick. So you can see the finger choil thins out all the way to the point of the edge. And that means that when you get your finger in here, you're really pushing up against super thin metal. And that's just a bit of a hot spot. The kind of crux of your index finger here ends up aligning pretty well with this section, and so this ends up digging in here pretty well. And if you're putting a lot of pressure on it and you're holding it for a little while, that does get pretty hot, and it even cuts off the circulation a bit to the tip of your finger. So I would have appreciated a little bit more thickness for the finger choil here, and that they had managed to do the plunge grind in a little less aggressive of a way, maybe further up in the knife, so that I could have had some more thickness here. That's something that I would have appreciated. So choking up on the knife, not quite as ergonomic as if you were to hold the knife in a normal saber grip, but it still works. It's just not the greatest. So moving on from there, I want to talk about the blade. We do have a tall, flat grind on a reasonably thin blade stock. This isn't too thick. I think it's actually, let me check here. The PM2, I think, even has some thickness on it. Just barely. They might be almost the same, but the PM2 is even slightly thicker blade stock than this. So that's something that I can appreciate. Anytime you have reasonable blade stock with a really tall, flat grind, you know you're going to get an excellent slicer. You have a standard drop point shape, which means that the knife is going to make a great piercer. It's pretty thin behind the point here. This swedge is pretty aggressive, which really means that there isn't too much thickness behind the point. So it's going to be a great piercer, and then it's also going to make a great slicer, as you do have a large belly throughout the knife, and then again, this very tall flat grind on a relatively thin blade stock. So this is a super useful blade shape, and it's going to be really useful in all normal EDC tasks, so I definitely can appreciate that. Moving on, WE Knives took the hint on putting their Star hardware on, or using it for inlays. So if you guys remember, I had a video on the model number is escaping me right now. It was one of the earlier models, maybe the 608 or something like that. I'd have to go back and check, but it was one of the earlier models, and it was the first model that they did that was a titanium frame lock with a carbon fiber inlay. And if you guys remember from that video, in the carbon fiber inlay, the Star hardware was fairly exposed in terms of the shape of the handle, or sorry, the contouring of the frame was very rounded. So you had the Star hardware just kind of sticking up, and you could catch your finger on it. And it was fairly sharp, and it just wasn't the most amazing thing to feel. And when you really gripped on the knife, when you really bear down on it, you could feel the Star hardware kind of poking up and grabbing at your fingers and your hand. And so that wasn't the most comfortable thing, and it was a big complaint for me in that video. And as you guys can see, now that WE Knives has progressed a little bit, I'm trying to show you guys. So you can see here on this carbon fiber inlay, they have actually raised the milling of the inlay up and around the screw. And so that was a really thoughtful thing to do. They even did it on the reverse side in the titanium here, which is much easier to see, I'm realizing, because the light bounces off of it better. And that's just something that I can appreciate. There are rumors going around. It may or may not be true. I have not confirmed with WE knives themselves, but I am given to understand that they have finally done away with the star hardware. They've just realized that it's too much of a limiting factor. I have to imagine that Nick Shabazz has something to do with that decision. If not directly, then indirectly is just kind of a catalyst, something to push the idea along. But I've always been a big fan of the way the Star hardware looks, and I really like that it sets their knives apart. But at the end of the day, I have tried to disassemble multiple WE knives, and I've always struggled with the tool that they provide. Because they provide one tool for 3 different sizes of screws, it only really works on like the medium-sized screw, and then you end up stripping them out, and it's just not a good look. And so if they do actually move to Torx hardware, I would definitely appreciate that. However, in the meantime, I think it was super great of them to take into consideration that they need to reduce the amount of hot spots when doing inlays. So good on them for raising the contouring around the screws so you don't feel them as much. That's awesome. Now, moving along, the backspacer and the clip on this knife are fairly generic as far as a 3D milled titanium hardware is concerned. The clip has good tension to it, it's got good distance, and it's going to function average, slightly above average. It's going to act like pretty much any 3D milled titanium clip that you're used to on a production knife at this point. They've become very common, and it's not hard to imagine how well that works. And then of course the backspacer does have some jimping on it, which is good. It does give you a little bit of grip if you are flipping the knife and it's kind of rubbing up against here. And they did manage to stick a lanyard hole in there as well. So again, fairly generic, but I see no quality issues. I can't see through the backspacer at all. There's no voids. Everything is perfectly fitted and everything like that. So it's just a good working backspacer and a good working clip. Now, I must say, my least favorite thing about this knife is the lock bar. It really could be friendlier. So what they've done here is just a 90-degree angle. It is ever so slightly kind of sanded away so that it's not completely slice-worthy. It's not an exact 90-degree angle. But they didn't do any contouring in here for your finger. That's something that's pretty common. They've done it here on the 604. There's this little indentation, this little contouring. We're pretty used to that on frame lock flippers at this point. I think that's a completely expected and reasonable thing to expect on a knife. And so what that does mean is that when I am disengaging this lock bar, it is absolutely a hot spot. You can perhaps see some of the deformation on my thumb there just from pushing on it a couple times. And so I really am bummed out with that. They did such a great job taking all those hot spots and ergonomics and everything into consideration on this knife, and then it seems like a total failure to just not include a little bit of a relief in the lock bar for your thumb to be comfortable. Lock bar tension is a little bit on the stronger side, and so that, along with the 90-degree angle, definitely makes for a hot spot. And if you are going to buy this knife as a fidgeter, it's going to kind of annoy you. It just seems like something that was forgotten about. Most of their knives have the little relief, the little contouring. It seems like a pretty normal thing to do. Doesn't seem like it would really increase the cost of manufacture that much. It's just one more little scrape of the mill machine, and it would be a big problem solved. So I'm a little bit bummed out about that. That seems like a missed opportunity on this one. Moving on, I do really like the little detail of cutting the hole out of the flipper tab. That's something that I've always been a fan of. Obviously, it's entirely personal preference. It's just an aesthetic thing. It has no value mechanically. But I remember getting the Wayfarer 247 last year and being really excited about the skeletonized flipper tab. And then, of course, that's something that definitely appears on many South African knives. You can see on the Iroquois that I have here, the Keith Kruger K4, and of course my Thorburn that's laying around somewhere, they all have the holes kind of cut into the flipper tabs, and I just think it adds a little bit of pizzazz. It's something that I enjoy, and of course that's again entirely personal preference. Some people will argue that it gets filled with like pocket lint and stuff. Yeah, that's true to an extent, but it's nothing that's going to bother you, and it's no more junk gets caught up in there than it does anywhere else in the knife. So a typical cleaning is going to take care of that. And frankly, there's just not much else to say about this knife. It's a great knife. It's a great little EDC. If you enjoy the way that it looks aesthetically, it's absolutely worth the price tag. I really think that WE knives, they tend to knock it out of the park. They always have, slight things that they can improve upon. Again, with this particular knife, it is the lock bar. But one little flaw or a couple little flaws on a reasonably priced production knife is perfectly acceptable as far as I'm concerned. The company is always growing. They're always adding new models to their lineup. They have pretty crazy models to choose from, and so obviously you're going to get a hot spot there and stuff like that as they explore all kinds of different designs. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be a great EDC. Again, that blade shape is absolutely phenomenal for EDC tasks. I really like the saber grip ergonomics. I think it does a great job. And the flipping action is absolutely to die for. It's fantastic for a $300 knife or a $250 knife, however much you end up paying for it. I think you can find it at some different price points depending on where you buy. But yeah, they've got the contouring cut out of the carbon fiber here very well, which is tough to do. Carbon fiber is not the easiest material to work with. And so they did a great job. The centering's dead on. Everything about the knife is totally functionally perfect. They really did a good job. So I hope you guys enjoyed that video. Please remember that you can follow me on Instagram if you'd like to see pictures of all these beautiful knives. And if you would like to see videos of those knives, you can always subscribe. That's definitely appreciated. If you would all like to send me a lovely loaner, you can do so by emailing me at tovarishworks. And thanks so much for watching, guys. I will see you next time.